Hey friends, tonight, we begin not with a sword, nor a trial, nor a gallows creaking in the wind. We begin with a scent, faint, sweet, like crushed almonds, or the memory of springtime. A scent that drifted through curtains, across vineyards, and into the lungs of men who would not wake the next morning. This is not the Italy they show in paintings, the one with chubby cherubs and singing gondoliers. No, this Italy is quieter, slower, and significantly more dangerous if you happen to drink the wrong tea. It's 1536 in Florence. The bells are ringing, the silk trade is booming, and everyone important is plotting to kill everyone else, usually with a smile, sometimes with a pen, and occasionally with a sprig of foxglove tucked behind the ear. Our story takes root in a villa just outside the city. A pale building with tall windows, long shadows, and a garden that never bloomed quite the same way twice. This garden wasn't for picnics, it was for practice. The woman who owned it didn't attend court. She didn't host salons. She didn't paint, sing, or embroider tragic saints. But she did grow aconite in pots shaped like lions' heads. And if you asked nicely, she might just tell you which leaf makes a man's heart stop without leaving a mark. Her name was Isabella di Cressy. To the outside world, she was a widow. To a select few, she was something else entirely. A fixer, a herbalist, a solution when you needed someone to vanish discreetly and without complaint. Because in Renaissance Italy, you didn't always need an army. Sometimes you just needed a dinner invitation and a garden. Now, before you start worrying, no, you're not about to hear a list of gruesome deaths or graphic details. This isn't that kind of tale. Instead, you'll walk beside her, quietly. At night, as the moon paints the garden silver and the air smells like laudanum and lavender. You'll feel the weight of the pouch she ties to her belt. You'll hear the creak of her gloves as she prepares another treatment. And maybe you'll understand how power doesn't always come from a throne. Sometimes, it comes from a mortar and pestle. Isabella didn't come from nobility. Not really. Her father had been a merchant of fabrics, clever with numbers and quick with a joke, but nobody feared him. Her mother, on the other hand, had been terrifying in that soft, deliberate way that only Italian matriarchs and very successful spiders can manage. She taught Isabella early how to read plants like prayers, how to steep, grind, and extract, how to offer comfort with one hand and hold secrets in the other. You must never use poison, she had said, stirring a pot of broth with angelica root, unless it's absolutely necessary. In which case, use the good stuff. By 14, Isabella could diagnose a fever by scent and put a man to sleep for 3 days using only fig wine and 2 seeds. By 18, she was married off to a Florentine bureaucrat, twice her age. He died 3 winters later after developing a sudden and suspicious allergy to shellfish despite never having eaten it. The cause of death was recorded as divine mystery. Isabella wore black, wept beautifully, and returned to her villa, with a dowry untouched and a reputation sharpened like scissors. And so the garden grew, not just in size, but in purpose. Word began to circulate, never aloud, never directly. She helps women in trouble, they said. She can fix things husbands break. She knows what to add to wine when someone needs to forget. The villa gained visitors, women always alone, always in deep, expensive silence. Some left with little brown vials wrapped in velvet. Others stayed for hours, emerging with eyes that had just seen the blueprint of their next move. Isabella didn't charge money. Not directly. Instead, she collected favors, promises, information, the sort of currency that didn't rust and couldn't be taxed. One summer, she assisted the wife of a banker whose interest rates had been climbing just a bit too fast. That autumn, the banker developed a persistent tremor in his hands, making him unfit to sign contracts. Another time, she received a visit from a duchess whose brother-in-law was making himself a little too comfortable in the family treasury. He developed a fear of figs so severe he refused to attend meals altogether. But it wasn't just punishment. Isabella also healed. She knew remedies no physician could name. She once cured a merchant's son of seizures using something that smelled like burnt cinnamon and made your ears ring. She made elixirs for childbirth, for sleep, for forgetting, and on rare occasions for remembering. when the truth was too slippery to catch on your own. She was not feared like an assassin, or reviled like a witch. She was respected like the river, deep, winding, and always 2 steps ahead of where you expected her to be. Of course, there were rumors. Some said she could make a man fall in love or out of it with just a touch. Others claimed she owned a snake with 2 heads and kept it in the cellar to test dosages. A few whispered that she wasn't truly human at all, but the ghost of a betrayed nun with a talent for revenge. Isabella ignored the talk. She wasn't interested in being famous, only useful. Then came the letter. It arrived in early spring, sealed with wax as red as oxblood, and delivered by a courier who didn't know who had paid him. Inside, a single sentence written in a careful, expensive hand. My wife is no longer suitable for court. I require your assistance. Payment will be exquisite. No name, no address. Just instructions. Meet at dusk, under the cypress trees, beyond San Miniato, Al Monte. Come alone. Bring only your skill. Most people would have burned the letter, or at least waited until daylight. Isabella folded it once, tucked it into the sleeve of her gown, and went to sharpen her scissors. The meeting place was older than Florence, some said. The air up there always felt thinner, more aware. Cypress trees rose like dark fingers, and the wind carried the scent of basil and bones. She waited. 1 minute, 5:12. Then footsteps. Out of the trees stepped a man dressed in gray, expensively plain. Like someone who didn't want to be noticed, but still needed to be obeyed. He didn't speak right away. Just looked at her the way generals look at maps. Then, "You come highly recommended." "I rarely come at all," Isabella replied. "But here I am." He smiled faintly, like someone checking for traps. "My wife," he said, "has become inconvenient." "How inconvenient?" she asked. "She speaks too much. Dreams too loudly. Writes poems. Some of them political." "Ah," Isabella said, as if diagnosing a rash. "A fatal condition, I've heard." "I need her quiet," he said. "Not dead. Just silent. Softened." "I can soften," she said. "It costs extra. Payment is no concern." It never was, with men like him. They parted with no handshake, no names. Isabella returned to her garden. She walked among the plants, running her fingers across soft leaves and brittle stems. Belladonna, too dangerous. Valerian, too gentle. Henbane, possibly. Or perhaps something gentler still. Something that would dull the mind slowly, invisibly. She worked by moonlight, humming a lullaby her mother used to sing over pots of foxglove tea. She brewed until dawn, until the liquid in her vial shimmered like moonlight in a glass of oil, 3 drops under the tongue. That's all it would take. Memory would fray like old lace. Names would slip. Opinions would dissolve. A gentle forgetting. She sent the vial in a wooden box carved with olive branches. No name, no instructions. Just the vial. That was enough. 2 weeks passed. Then came another letter. This one shorter. Only 3 words. She remembers everything. Which, of course, meant someone had lied. Or someone had tampered. Or, worst of all, someone was watching her. The garden suddenly felt smaller. The shadows longer. The air sharp with warning. Because Isabella di Cressy had never failed. Not once. And if someone wanted to remind her that she was mortal, well, they'd better be very, very careful about what they planted next. The vial hadn't worked. That was the only certainty Isabella could pull from the silence. The woman, whoever she truly was, had swallowed it, sipped it, let it rest on her tongue like a stolen promise. And nothing had happened. No confusion, no gentling of the thoughts. No soft dimming of fire behind the eyes. She remembered everything. It was not a failure of formula. Isabella didn't make mistakes. Not in this garden. Not in this craft. Every measurement was exact. Every root aged properly. Every infusion stirred until it gleamed like certainty. No, the failure meant only one thing. The patient hadn't been alone, and that was what disturbed her. Someone had interfered. Or someone had known exactly what to expect, and exactly how to undo it. There were antidotes, of course. Rare, costly, hidden in the margins of books. Only 3 people in Europe still owned. But it was more likely this wasn't about chemistry. It was about people, power, position. Perhaps the wife had never been the target. Perhaps Isabella had. And that changed the entire flavor of the air. She began to walk the garden at night, not because she feared it, but because she wanted it to know she was watching too. The garden was no passive place. It breathed, shifted, remembered. There were paths that always seemed longer after midnight, roots that nudged your foot when you lied. And in the far back corner, near the dried lavender and marjoram, was a gate that had never opened for anyone but her. It was there she stood now, fingers brushing a cluster of dried monkshood, lips pursed like someone calculating distance and blood type. Behind her, the wind moved slow and syrupy, as if not quite sure where to settle. She didn't need answers yet. She needed direction, and in Florence, direction had a name. Cecilia Sarzetti, Florence's most elegant liability. A widow, twice over, a patron of artists, mathematicians, and on discreet Thursdays scandalous conversation. She hosted salons in a house that smelled of cardamom and guilt. She wore silk-like armor and laughed like she knew who'd die next. More importantly, Cecilia knew everything. She had fingers in more pies than a festival cook, and her servants never listened at doors they recited. If someone had paid for a tampered tincture, or protected a very inconvenient wife, Cecilia would know, or know someone who knew. And Isabella, for once, was willing to trade information for something as mundane as truth. They met, not in a parlor, but in a bathouse. It was a place Isabella normally avoided. Too much steam, too little privacy, but, Cecilia insisted. She was already reclined against a marble basin, half submerged, a glass of pomegranate, cordial balanced on one knee. Well, she purred, if it isn't my favorite myth. I didn't come to chat, Isabella said, removing her gloves. You never do, Cecilia replied, tilting her head. Still, I'm honored. I need a name, I need a context. Isabella paused. Normally, she danced around subjects, like a cat around a too-hot stovetop. But now, ... Something deeper pulled at her ribs. An urgency. Someone used me, she said quietly. Or tried to. Through a woman who was supposed to forget, but didn't. Cecilia's eyes narrowed with interest. She sipped her drink and motioned for a servant to leave. That sounds like a Botticelli painting gone wrong, she said at last. Florence is full of those lately. She stood, wrapping herself in a towel that probably cost more than most. People's homes, and stepped closer. Do you know who this wife is? No. Do you know who sent the letter? No. And yet, here you are. Yes, Cecilia sighed with satisfaction, as if she'd just found a particularly delicious lie. I might know someone, or something, but you won't like it. I never like anything, Isabella replied. That's why I survive. Cecilia leaned closer. There's a man, she whispered, who's been asking about you, quietly, always through others, always in the third degree. But his money is loud. Name, none given. But he wears an emerald on his thumb, and only drinks red wine from silver. One of those. Not a name, but almost. Isabella filed it away like an ingredient, unfamiliar, but likely flammable. Cecilia's voice dropped further, until it felt like velvet between the bones. And there's more, she said. Word is, this man isn't looking to erase you. He's looking to claim you. To tie your work to his name, permanently. That would be a mistake. That's what I told the last man who tried to flirt with you, using fennel metaphors. Isabella allowed herself the ghost of a smile. When she returned to the villa, the garden felt different. Not wrong, just ... Watchful, as if something had shifted beneath the roots. As if the soil itself had begun to murmur. She stood on the threshold, and whispered softly, Whoever you are, if you think you can bury me in my own ground, you'll have to use better tools. Then she lit the lanterns. The blue ones. The ones that only burned when something dangerous had crossed the threshold. They flared. Bright, hungry, immediate. Someone had entered recently, unseen. She moved quickly now, gown tied at the waist, slippers silent. Through the hallway past the study, into the old servants' wing she never used. their dust disturbed, a chair askew, a single broken stem of mandrake on the floor, as if someone had tried to pocket it and failed. Not a thief, too subtle for that. Not an assassin, to patient a message. But what kind? She waited until night thickened and sleep touched even the owls. Then she lit her smallest lamp, opened her book of recipes, and turned to the page she hadn't read in years. The page marked contingencies. There were 7 recipes. One was for forgetting, one was for remembering, one was for vengeance, so slow it tasted like honey. The rest, well, the rest weren't legal even by Renaissance standards. She chose the second. If someone was testing her using wives and salons and spies, then she would not retreat. She would not defend. She would remember more than them. She would find the wife, not the letter, not the man, not the court, the woman. Because whoever she was, whomever she had been meant to become, she had looked at the bottle, swallowed the drops, and still remembered. That meant she was special, or terrified, or both. Either way, she was the key. Isabella dressed plainly the next morning. No gloves, no veil, no rings with tiny compartments. Just a simple dress, and the kind of calm that made people instinctively nervous. She started at the churches, not for prayer, but for record books, marriages, baptisms, patronages, donations large enough to leave a trace, but discreet enough to hide intent, then to the bakeries. Gossip lived there, sticky and warm, then to the dressmakers. Tailors knew more about women's lives than husbands did. And then, finally, to the APOT, ECARIES. It took 6 days, 6 sons, 6 very careful questions, phrased like curiosity and concern. But at last, she heard it, a name, Vittoria della Mara. Once praised for her embroidery, now rumored to wander her estate, speaking in rhymes. Once welcomed to every banquet, now hidden behind closed doors with a nurse who never left. Vittoria, the wife who remembered. Isabella stood at the gates of the Mara estate 2 nights later, watching the light in the topmost window flicker like a heartbeat in a fever. She did not knock. She waited, and sure enough, just before the hour of deepest dark a figure appeared on the path. Not the husband, not the nurse, the woman herself. She moved like someone underwater. Not clumsy, just slow, floating. She looked at Isabella, not surprised, not afraid. Just, ... awake. You came, Vittoria said, voice like bruised silk. You sent for me, Isabella replied. No, she said, eyes steady. I remembered you. And then she held out a hand. Not to beg, to offer something in her palm. A ring, silver, heavy, etched with an emerald leaf and an initial .F, the same as the seal. The same as the man. Do you know what this means? Vittoria asked. Yes, Isabella said quietly. It means he's no longer hiding. She closed her fingers over the ring and looked up at the window. Tomorrow, she would return to the garden. But tonight, the seeds of something else had begun to grow. Not fear, not poison, but war. The war didn't begin with a trumpet. It began with tea. Or more precisely, with a question over T1. Isabella posed quietly, without raising her eyes, as steam curled between them like a third guest neither had invited. Does he know you remember? Vittoria held the cup between both hands, careful not to drink. The rim trembled just slightly, though her voice did not. No, I don't think he suspects, not fully. And yet he sent the ring. Yes, why? Vittoria looked up then, and for the first time, Isabella saw what the garden had never taught her. The difference between fear and calculation. He wants me afraid, she said softly, afraid enough to keep pretending, afraid enough to stay quiet. But he doesn't know you came. Isabella sipped her tea and let the quiet stretch. The villa, though grand, felt hollow around them like a shell, still pretending it had something alive inside. The curtains were drawn, the fire low. Outside, the wind moved through the olive trees like a woman searching for her lost shoes. What does he want, really? Isabella asked. At last, Vittoria stared into the fire. When she spoke, again, Her voice came from somewhere else. He wants to control Florence. Everyone wants to control Florence. He wants to do it through bloodlines. That made Isabella pause. She set her cup down gently, like it might crack under the weight of what was coming. Bloodlines, she repeated. Inheritance. Worse, Vittoria said. Legacy. And suddenly, the puzzle pieces clicked. Not perfectly, but enough to form an outline. This wasn't about a wife, or a tincture, or a garden. This was about lineage. Who carried which names, who whispered which secrets into which children's ears. It was about power not seized in the marketplace, but handed down at dinner tables, through veils, through cradles, and somewhere. In that line stood Vittoria, or more precisely what she could bear. Isabella breathed in, and the air tasted bitter. "You're pregnant," she said quietly. Vittoria didn't flinch. Not yet, but he intends. Yes, and just like that, the garden inside, Isabella stirred. Not the flowers, not the herbs. The old roots. The ones that had known what to do with broken women before they even said a word. She stood. "I'm taking you with me." Vittoria blinked. Where he won't follow. "You think there is such a place?" Isabella's eyes narrowed. "There is, and it grows." They left before dawn. Not hurried movement drew questions. Just deliberately, like two women taking an early walk, one with a satchel of dried herbs, the other with nothing at all. The horses waited down past the olive grove. The road out of the estate curved like a question mark written in gravel and fog. By the time the servants noticed the absence, the women were already halfway to Seney. The garden welcomed them like a breath held too long. It knew Vittoria before Isabella said a word. The gate creaked open softly, the lavender swayed just once, and the wind dropped as if to listen. Inside, the air thickened. Not in danger. In purpose, Vittoria walked the paths in silence, eyes wide, fingertips brushing petals like she was reading. Frail Isabella watched her closely. Not for illness, not for guilt, for strength, because now she needed an ally, not a patient. In the cellar, beneath layers of dust and ritual, Isabella kept the ledger. Not of finances, of favors, each name. Written in ink made from gall and iron, each date carefully noted. Some marked with a red dot, some with two, a few scratched out completely. She flipped through it now. Slowly, as Vittoria made broth above. The smell of rosemary curling down the stairs like a soft alarm. The names she needed were near the back. Adelina Volterra, midwife, memory-like. A razor dot, Brother Tommaso, monk, gardener. Bruce Forgetfulness, by the barrel. Nerina Bassi, owned 6 dogs, 3 secrets, and 1 printing press no one knows about. All of them owed her. And all of them disliked men who played empire with women's. WOMBS. The first to arrive was Adelina. She knocked twice, then entered like she owned the villa. She brought no bag, just a small silver pin shaped like a cicada, and eyes that hadn't blinked properly since the siege of Volterra. "So," she said, looking at Vittoria without flinching. "This is the womb in question." Vittoria almost smiled. It came out more like a wince. "She's not pregnant," Isabella clarified. "Yet good," Adelina said. "Then we have time." "What do you mean we?" Vittoria asked, a note of skepticism finally creeping in. Adelina turned to her. "Do you want to disappear, or win?" Vittoria hesitated, then both. Adelina nodded. "Then eat well and sleep deeply. We'll need your spine." In the days that followed, the villa became something else. Not a sanctuary, not a fortress, a forge. They fed Vittoria a mixture of fennel and rue, meant to keep her womb quiet, and her thoughts sharp. Isabella brewed oils that smelled like safety and tasted like thunder. Adelina measured pulses and futures. And then came Nerina. She arrived with ink-stained fingers and a bag full of pages blank ones. She spoke quickly, as if her thoughts had deadlines. She asked only one question. "Do you want Florence to know the truth, or just whisper it?" "No," said Vittoria, without hesitation. "Then I'll need your handwriting," Nerina replied, pulling out a quill and a paper already primed with lemon. What will she write? Isabella asked. Her story, said Nerina, with footnotes. And so Vittoria wrote, at night, under the blue lamps. In the quiet hour after the last tea had cooled, and the garden leaned in to listen. She wrote about her husband, and his plans. About the other women names only half remembered who had vanished. After one too many clever thoughts. She wrote about the poison that had not worked, and the woman who had brewed it anyway. She wrote about legacy, and how sometimes the only way to end a bloodline was to dry the roots. And Nerina, for her part, made sure the words would fly. The printing press hummed like a sleeping beast. Pages rolled like spells being cast, and somewhere in Florence, people began to murmur. Have you read the letter? Have you seen what she said? Did you know what the Maraman's wife has confessed? And through it all, Isabella waited. Not because she feared him, but because she knew how men like him reacted when the story slipped out of their hands. They came not with apologies, but with torches, and when they came, if they came, Isabella would not hide. She would stand at the garden gate, and she would welcome them in. The letter had burned through Florence like sweet oil on a church floor, slow, fragrant, and impossible to ignore. No name signed at the bottom, just a symbol, a vine curling around a dagger. But no one needed a name. They knew, because of the handwriting. They knew because of the cadence. And they knew because no man alive would dare accuse a noble so openly, so elegantly, unless he wanted to be exiled from both flesh and city. The pamphlet was short, 3 pages, unassuming, but within its folds, confession, revelation, war cries sewn in silk. It did not scream. It hummed like something venomous, hiding in a flute's melody. By noon of the second day, 3 copies had reached the archbishop. By dusk, 15 had made it to wives by morning. Every woman who had ever heard the word obedience whispered, like a curse, had a copy tucked beneath her pillow. They read it in secret. They folded it into prayer books. They passed it between stitches at the seamstresses. The title was simple, An Herbal for the Daughters of Florence. But its content was no recipe. It was a reckoning. The man it spoke of, never named, but meticulously described, was unmissable. A patron of the guilds. A collector of Greek statuary. A husband. A widower. A financier of civic fountains and private laboratories. And now, the subject of a quiet, growing fury. He was, of course, the same man who wore the emerald ring. The same man who'd sent the letter to Isabella's gate, and now he was no longer a shadow. He was a target. But men like him didn't cower when exposed. They didn't flee, or weep, or beg. They retaliated, and the first retaliation came not in violence, but in flowers, a bouquet, delivered to the garden gate at dawn, orchids and foxglove, sprigs of bleeding heart, all wrapped in a crimson ribbon. No card, but the message was clear. He knew where she was. Isabella stared at it a long time. Then she reached into her apron, drew a small silver knife, and cut the ribbon, one smooth motion. The bouquet collapsed. She knelt, inspecting each flower, her expression unreadable. Then, wordlessly, she gathered them all into a copper, potted vinegar, salt, and flame. Let the perfume become smoke. When Vittoria entered the kitchen, the scent was already curling into the ceiling beams. Did he answer? He did, Isabella said. And he's pretending it's still a game, but it isn't. No, it never was. That afternoon the bees arrived. Not real bees. Men too, well-dressed, polite, neither armed nor threatening. But their hands were too clean, and their eyes too still. They asked for Madonna Isabetta. They smiled when they said her name. We come bearing a request. The taller one said. Then you've come to the wrong door, Isabella replied, gently closing it in their faces. She waited, counted to 6, then opened it again. They'll be back, she said aloud, to no one, that night. She gathered her allies in the apothecary room, Vittoria, Adelina, Nerina, and now, one more brother, Tommaso. He had arrived just past vespers, robes dusty, breath smelling faintly of pine sap and secrets. Are you certain you want to do this? He asked, looking around the small circle of women. I'm certain I don't want to die quietly, Vittoria replied. I'm certain she doesn't want to be claimed like livestock, said Nerina. I'm certain I have already lost too much, added Adelina, and I'd like to be useful before the next loss. Tommaso smiled, a monk's smile, which is to say tired and full of unwanted truth. Then let us begin. What they began was not a rebellion. Not exactly. There were no banners, no slogans. It was quieter than that. Slower, they made soap infused with rue and secrets. They brewed tonics, one that settled the stomach, another that made a man's mouth too dry to lie. They printed letters not to accuse, but to warn. Women, sisters, widows, daughters of bakers, and daughters of judges alike, and always they planted in every bundle of herbs sold a slip of paper, in every dried bouquet a symbol carved in ink made from walnut and wormwood, the vine and the dagger. It wasn't a movement, it was a network. By the time the second wave of men arrived, 3 of them, this time louder, hungrier, the garden was already listening. They came with parchment, a summons, sealed. Isa. Beta accepted it without comment, read it, smiled, tore it in half, then, ever so calmly, sprinkled the pieces with lavender oil, and set them aflame on the stone step. Tell your master, she said, that I do not respond to paper threats. If he wants me, he may come himself. The men looked at each other. One laughed. That man would be found 5 days later, blind in one eye, muttering about blue lights in the woods. Still, no soldiers arrived. That was how she knew it was working. He was scared, not of weapons, of reputation, because now he wasn't a nobleman. He was a name, whispered in pastry shops, a face drawn in charcoal by someone who had heard the story, not seen it. He was becoming legend, and legends were fragile things. On the 7th day, Vittoria bled. Not from harm, but from strength. She stood in the garden, feet bare, eyes open, and let it come. Not from pain, from choice. She would not bear his child. She would not be the conduit of his ambitions. Adelina stood with her, steady and silent. She offered no comfort, only a basin of warm water and a linen cloth. It was done before midnight, and when the blood was buried beneath the rosebush, the petals opened wider than they ever had. The next morning, Isabella lit a candle, a blue one. It meant one thing. Prepared, she went to the root cellar, not for ingredients, for the satchel, the one she hadn't touched in years. It contained 4 vials, 1 small blade, a length of cord, a dried flower that no longer grew above ground. She held it in her palm. Are we at war? Asked Tommaso, entering. Softly, no, she replied. Not yet. Then what are we? She looked up, eyes like calm fire. We are what grows when you think you've salted the earth. No birds sang that morning, not because they were gone, but because they were listening. A silence like that doesn't come from accident. It comes from anticipation. Like the world holding its breath between thunderclaps, Isabella stepped out into the courtyard before sunrise, the satchel still slung across her back like an old oath. The garden was quiet, but not still. The fennel tilted just slightly. The yarrow turned its leaves. Even the sage, stubborn and weather-worn, gave off a different kind of scent. Not sweet, not bitter, just ready. She knelt beside the Rosemaryenne, old friend, and whispered. Soon, behind her, the villa exhaled. The old wood beams creaked like someone shifting in their sleep. But no one was sleeping now. Upstairs, Vittoria stood before the mirror, no longer in linen, but in armor of another kind. A dress the color of wet stone, sleeves tight to the wrist. Nothing to catch or snag. Her hair was braided, pinned low. Around her neck, a charm of rue and iron, hidden beneath the collar. She looked at herself like one would examine a blade before a duel, not vain, not fearful, just exact. Isabella entered quietly. He sent a carriage, she said. Vittoria nodded. Of course he did. You don't have to go. I do. Why? Because if I don't, he controls the story. That was answer enough. The carriage stood waiting beyond the gate, flanked by 2 mounted guards. Not soldiers, guards. Too ornate, too clean. Men paid to escort, not fight. And yet their hands hovered just slightly above the hilts of their swords. As Vittoria approached, she didn't flinch. Isabella stood just behind her, satchel slung loose, eyes scanning every leaf, every twitch of birdwing above the trellis. The coachman said nothing, just opened the door. Vittoria turned once, gave Isabella a nod, and stepped in. The door closed like a tomb. The ride into Florence was slow, deliberate. Not bumpy too many people would have seen, too many eyes to impress. No, the carriage moved, like a lie carefully told. Smooth, decorated, but Vittoria felt every turn, every hoofbeat, like a drum in her spine. And behind her, in the shadow of the cypress grove, another horse moved silently. Ridden by Tommaso. Florence was waking by the time they arrived. But the city felt different now. Something hung in the air, not fog, not incense. Awareness. People glanced longer than usual. Doors opened and closed a little slower. Even the cats on the roof tiles paused in their sunbathing, as if listening for a name whispered beneath carriage wheels. He was waiting, of course. Not in a courtroom, not in a study, but in a salon. Walls covered in tapestries. A chandelier of blown glass. Cushioned chairs that looked soft and sounded silent. Too much wine, too few books. And there, him, still tall, still manicured, still draped in all the trappings of a man who believed taste could stand in for character. He rose slowly as she entered, like a snake choosing which angle to strike from. "Vittoria," he said, spreading his arms as if this were a reunion. At last, she did not smile. "You summoned me?" He waved the comment away. "Summoned. Come now, I invited you. As any concerned husband would. I am not your wife. Legally you are. Morally, I am not." That hung in the air, dense, cold. He gestured to the seat opposite him. She sat. "Would you like tea?" he asked. "I brought my own." She withdrew a small silver vial from her sleeve and set it on the table between them. He didn't touch it. "You've changed," he said. "No," she replied. "I've grown." A pause. "Then, why did you write it?" "I didn't." He raised an eyebrow. "But I read it," she continued, "and I agreed with every word." His hand twitched. "Just once. Enough for her to see. You realize what you've done?" "Yes, you've made a fool of me." "No," Vittoria said. "You did that yourself. I just provided the audience." That was the moment it broke. His smile faltered. His eyes lost their sheen. The mask cracked, just enough to show the metal underneath. "You think Florence will protect you?" he hissed. "No," she said. "But the garden will." And in that moment he understood. Not the literal garden. Not the one with thyme and foxglove. The garden of women. Women who watched, who whispered, who stirred herbs, not just for fevers, but for freedom. She rose. "I came here to let you speak," she said. "To see if there was anything left worth listening to. And," she turned, "I was right to burn your letters." Then she left. She didn't run, didn't look back, and he didn't follow, but others did. Behind her, as she stepped back into the street, 2 women fell in beside her. One carried bread, the other, laundry. Both were watching. Across the square, a butcher's daughter made a sign in the ervine and dagger. On the rooftop, a boy blew a whistle, high and sharp. Signals everywhere. By the time Vittoria reached the edge of the city, the network had moved. Not to attack, to witness, because they knew what came next. Retaliation, or silence. But either way, the moment had passed. He was no longer feared, he was contained. And when Vittoria reached the villa again, the first thing she did was take off the iron charm, set it on the stone table, and crush it beneath her palm. "No more protection," she said. "Only truth." Isabella nodded, her eyes not leaving the gate. In the kitchen, Adelina stirred a new tincture. Stronger. On the porch, Tommaso oiled a blade with olive wax and nettle. And in the cellar, Nerina stacked fresh pages into crates lined with rosemary and lies, because the garden was growing now. Not just herbs. Revolt. And revolt does not bloom with flags and drums. It begins quieter than that, with a woman pouring tea, in a city that finally listens. The scent in the villa had changed. Not sweet, not bitter. It was the kind of smell that lingered low like stone after rain, like secrets simmering. The kind of scent that whispered warnings to those who understood. Vittoria moved through the house like a thread drawn through cloth, silent, steady, impossible to remove without unraveling everything. She stopped by the apothecary table. The scales were still balanced. The mortar was still damp, and in the corner, a jar of crushed hellebore leaned ever so slightly to the left. She reached out and turned it an inch. "There," she said to no one. "Now we're ready." Below, Isabella was boiling linen in sage water, her sleeves rolled, her eyes hollow from too many sleepless nights and not enough absolution. The garden had stopped being metaphor. Now it was laboratory. Command post. Church. Adelina stirred a tincture of foxglove and clove, marking each vial with a letter that didn't belong to the alphabet. Nerina wrote, faster than the ink could keep up. Her fingers blistered from too many pages and not enough hesitation. And on the far edge of the property, past the well that hadn't drawn water in months, Tommaso carved circles into the earth with a dagger tip. He didn't say what they meant. He never did. That night, the moon hung low, not full, not crescent. Something in between. A moon for choosing. They met in the garden under its watchful eye. The women, not just the ones from the villa. Others, a seamstress with a bruise she never explained. A widow who still wore black, though her husband had been buried 10 years ago. A girl with ink-stained sleeves and a stare too steady for her age. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. Vittoria stepped into the circle. No throne, no platform, just soft dirt and rosemary. She unpinned her braid, let the strands fall down like ribbons of iron. "You came," she said. A nod from the seamstress. "We're done. Hiding," she answered. And that was it. The beginning of it. Not rebellion in the streets, not fires or riots, but something slower, more dangerous. Infiltration in Florence. He was already reacting. Not with violence, with charm. Parties were thrown, poems recited, public donations made to churches he had never entered. He smiled more, shook, hands longer, spoke of regret and reconciliation, as if the words cost him nothing. And always, he asked after Vittoria, not with desperation, with strategy, but the city was no longer listening to him. Something in the air had shifted. People heard his laughter and looked away. Women moved their chairs a little farther from his at banquets. Men laughed a little too loudly at his jokes, and then quickly changed the subject. He was becoming a portrait in a cracked frame, still visible, but no longer precious, and he could feel it. So he turned to desperation. Disguised as diplomacy, he sent letters, not to the council, accusations framed as concerns, rumors disguised as civic warnings. "She traffics in dangerous ideas," he wrote. "She is encouraging sedition among women. She has aligned herself with criminals and alchemists. It would have worked a year ago. It almost worked now." But someone else read the letters before they reached their final desk. A clerk, quiet, gray-haired, forgotten by most. She read the accusations twice, then folded the parchment and slipped it into her apron. Later that evening, she walked the length of the Arno until she reached a shuttered tailor shop with a rosemary sprig tied to the doorknob. She knocked twice and handed the letters inside, back at the villa. The girls were laughing, not loudly, not freely, but laughing all the same. Vittoria sat on the steps, watching them, her hands wrapped around a mug of something thick and herbal. Tommaso stood beside her. "They're younger than you think," he said. "I know. They'll be hunted. They already are." He said nothing for a while. Then, "Do you have a plan?" Vittoria looked up at the stars. One blinked out. "No," she said. "But I have the truth." And then, quieter, "And I have them." The next blow came in silence. The baker's daughter, the one who'd signaled from the square, disappeared, not arrested, not questioned, just gone. Her mother said she'd left to marry in Pisa. But no one had met the husband. No. Bans had been read, and the rosemary at her windowsill had withered overnight. Isabella brought the news. Vittoria listened, then stood. "We respond," she said. Double quotes how? Nerina asked. With what? Letters, Vittoria replied. Pages, names. Adelina frowned. You mean, expose him? Vittoria shook her head. No, we plant him. It took 3 days, 3 nights. 7 couriers, and a monk, who only spoke in riddles. But the message reached every seamstress's attic, every nun's cloister, every apothecary's storeroom where women whispered. A play. Anonymous, staged by moonlight, just. Once it was called The Garden's Widow, and in it, a man with velvet gloves and rotted morals fell in love with a poisoner who spoke only in truths. He tried to charm her. She brewed him tea. By the end, he drank it, not because she made him, because she told him what it was, and he drank it anyway. The audience laughed not cruelly, but knowingly. In the council chambers, his face turned the color of salt. He stood, demanded the author be arrested, demanded the play be banned. But someone in the chamber coughed, then chuckled, and soon they were all laughing. Not at him, but near him, close enough to wound. He left before the vote, and when he opened the door to his carriage, there was a sprig of rue tied to the handle. He burned it, but the scent stayed on his gloves. Back at the Villa, Vittoria was already preparing the next step. Not poison. Not pamphlets, an invitation to him. A note folded like a petal. It read, "You wanted an audience. Come have tea." And he did. Because men like him can't resist a stage. He arrived with no guards, only a smile. She met him at the garden gate, served tea in porcelain rimmed with ash. Leaves. He didn't drink, but he also didn't leave. They sat for an hour, he talked. She listened, but not to the words, to the gaps, the hesitations, the soft betrayals of breath. When he finally stood, he looked confused, like he'd lost something, or left something behind, and perhaps he had, because the moment he passed the rosemary bush, his hands began to shake. A day later, his speeches stuttered. 2 days, he collapsed during a council dinner. 3 days, he lost his voice. The doctors said stress. He said conspiracy. The city said nothing, and the garden, it just grew. It started with a letter no one admitted to writing, folded twice, wax sealed with no sigil, left beneath the statue of San Nicolo, where the moss grew thickest, and children whispered stories about the saint who once wept blood. The letter made its way from fingers to fingers, from a courier who never remembered the hand that gave it, to a merchant's wife with ink on her cuff, to a young novice who delivered it, breathless, to the council's outer chambers, just before the hour of dusk. Inside, just 5 words. You'll need stronger poison soon. No signature, no accusation, just an observation. It was enough to stall a council vote, enough to cancel a banquet, enough to make 3 men suddenly develop stomach ailments they could not name and would not discuss. And somewhere in a villa where the wind smelled of rosemary and dead leaves, Vittoria folded herbs into cloth and said nothing. The game had shifted, not ended, just deepened, because power, when cornered, doesn't vanish. It mutates. That very night, the man who had once held court in Florence with wine-red robes and a voice sharp enough to bleed was writing again, but not to the council. To Rome he called it a confession, though nothing inside suggested guilt, only fear of a woman, of a movement, of a garden that grew things no one could classify. He spoke of witches, of unholy rites, of seductions cloaked in botany and betrayal. Disguised as tea, he used words like heresy. He called Vittoria a snake in velvet skin, and with each sentence, his hand trembled, not because he feared being found out, but because, in truth, he wasn't entirely sure anymore if he was lying. The letter reached Rome on a Thursday, was read by a bishop, whose name had been struck from 2 family wills for reasons never made public. He read it once, then twice, and then placed it inside a hollow book on forbidden texts, and left the room without comment. But silence in Rome was never stillness. By the following week, the first emissary had been dispatched, not with a guard, but with questions, to learn the shape of this garden, and to see if what bloomed there could be burned. Back in Florence, Vittoria was already ahead. She'd been expecting Rome since the moon turned in the apothecary wing. Isabella mixed a new Blendan infusion of violet root, powdered alum, and something unnamed that smelled faintly of copper. Adelina stitched sprigs of nightshade into the hems of ceremonial garments that hadn't been worn in a century, and Nerina transcribed an entire confession in mirror script and buried it beneath a false floorboard beneath the stairs. Vittoria, for her part, walked the halls more slowly, not because she was tired, because she was listening. For creaks, for lies, for ghosts. The emissary arrived at dusk. Naturally, they always arrived at dusk, as though twilight gave them more power, as though blending with the shadows made them immune to rot. He was young, not what she expected. He wore no gold, only gray, and he smiled like a man who'd already read your soul and found the margin notes amusing. Vittoria met him at the garden's edge, where the fennel grew tallest, and the rue refused to die. "Welcome," she said. He bowed. "Too deeply, Lady Vittoria." "I am Brother Luca." "Brother?" she asked, tilting her head. "Not father." He smiled again. "I am what the church sends when it's unsure whether it wants answers or ashes." She nodded. "Then I suppose we'll give you both." She offered tea. He declined, but stayed for 3 hours. They walked among the vines. He asked about scripture. She quoted Pliny. He asked about saints. She told him the recipe for an antidote that only worked if you'd never killed in anger. He laughed, but did not stop writing. When he finally left, his notebook was heavy, but so was his step, because somewhere between the roses and the hemlock, he had stopped asking questions and started wondering why he was afraid. 2 nights later, the council met in secret. 7 men, all sweating despite the cold, because they knew. The wind had changed, knew that Florence no longer tilted toward their son, and knew that the next move might cost more than coin or face. It might cost legacy, so they did what all-powerful men do when threatened. They stalled, they spoke in riddles, they postponed inquiries, they suggested committees, and cross-examinations, and theological reviews. And behind it all, they waited for Rome to decide. They forgot one thing. Rome already had. Brother Luca never sent his full report. He wrote it. Yes, pages of it, in perfect script, with citations and suspicions and warnings, shaped like blessings, but he never sent it. Instead, he sealed the pages in a jar of olive oil and buried it in the northern garden, right beneath the rosemary bush that never bloomed. Vittoria found it the next day. She didn't open it. She didn't have to. She simply placed a single violet beside it and walked away. The city had started to talk in new ways, not loudly, not in sermons or songs, but in gestures. Women began leaving bundles of herbs at doorsteps, not bouquets. Bundles, belladonna, with blue thread, mugwort, with twine, poppy seeds in a paper twist. Each one meant something. Be patient, be brave, be ready, and at dusk. In the quieter parts of the city, where light pooled like milk in cracked cobbles, strangers passed each other with soft nods, and sometimes with a single word, still, and always, the answer, still. But even gardens can be betrayed, and sometimes it is the soil itself that invites the rot. Her name was Livia, a new face, brought to the villa by Adelina, who swore by her a cousin, a refugee, a girl with gentle hands and empty eyes. She smiled too often. She asked too little, and when she wandered the halls at night, she never made noise. It took Vittoria 3 weeks to confirm it. She did not confront her. She did not accuse. She waited, and then, one night, simply asked, "Would you rather die quickly, or tell me who sent you?" Livia blinked, once, then smiled. "Both," she whispered, and swallowed something small and silver from beneath her tongue. She didn't make it past the door, but she left behind a single scrap of parchment in her boot. One word: sisterhood. The betrayal wasn't in Livia's death. It was in what followed. A raid. Not official, not uniformed, just shadows and torches. 6 men, armed, covered. Cowards, they thought they'd find a coven instead. They found a funeral. Livia was still warm. Vittoria stood beside the body, calm as dusk. Tommaso was already behind the gate. Nerina read from a book whose pages burned as she spoke them, and Isabella carried a vial the size of her thumb. By the time the men reached the main hall, 2 were blind, 1 was coughing blood. The rest were already running. They didn't return, but their failure didn't go unnoticed. The next morning, the council sent an ultimatum. Surrender, silence, or sanction. They expected fear. They expected negotiation. What they got was a flower, sent to each council member, pressed, preserved, poisonous, and note: "We are the garden, you are the rot. Pick wisely." Now, the city waits. For what? No one is certain. Some say the council will fall. Others say Rome will send fire. But in the villa, the women prepare. Not for war, not for peace, but for continuity. Vittoria teaches Isabella how to trace sigils into flower. Adelina writes new names in a ledger older than the city walls. And Nerina, for the first time, laughs in her sleep. Because the garden is not just a place, it's a vow. It grows, even in silence, even in fear, even in memory, and somewhere beneath the moon, where rosemary leans toward iron gates, and rue brushes the air like a warning. Vittoria whispers to the wind, "Let them come." And the wind, for once, whispers back, "They already have." The first frost came early. No one had expected it, certainly not in late autumn, when the olive trees were still holding their fruit, and the vineyards hadn't yet turned their leaves. But in the northern quarter of Florence, a thin film of white dusted the stones before dawn. Just frost, they said. Just weather. But by noon, every rosemary bush near the Arno had dropped its flowers. The petals curled as if scorched, even though the frost hadn't touched them. And on every doorstep near the city's oldest wells, someone found a sprig of rue wrapped in red thread. No one admitted to placing them. No one removed them, not even the priests. Because by then, even the church had learned how to listen. Back in the villa, the garden didn't freeze. Not entirely. The lavender turned gray. The poppies bowed low. But the hellebore stood tall, and the rue grew brighter. Vittoria walked barefoot across the garden paths before sunrise, testing the earth with the soles of her feet. Cold, yes, but still soft, still awake. Behind her, Adelina was folding parchment 10 slips, each one inked with a name and a symbol, a wheel, a needle, a broken crown. She tied them into vials and slipped them into a satchel lined with lamb's wool. Isabella was sleeping for the first time in 2 days. Her cheek pressed to a stack of notes, written in 3 languages, and 1 cipher that no one else had yet cracked. Nerina was gone. Not missing, just sent to Siena, with a list of women known only to the garden. Midwives, historians, a glass blower, who claimed to have forged a mirror that only showed truth. They would return before the equinox, or they wouldn't. Vittoria didn't ask for guarantees. She asked for intention. She got loyalty. Now only Tommaso remained in the outer wing. He no longer carved circles into the earth. Instead, he sharpened blades without names, some forged of iron, others of bone. And once, just once, he stood beneath Vittoria's window and whispered something no one else heard. Later, a crow dropped dead from the sky. The message had been received in the city. The council had grown quieter, not weaker, quieter. Their meetings still took place, but fewer records were kept. Their pronouncements became less fiery, more guarded. Their votes no longer unanimous, because fear had grown legs and learned how to walk into their chambers in plain robes. And one of them, a man named Salviati, whose chin always trembled when he lied, was now keeping 2 candles at his bedside. One for God, one for the garden. Not even his wife knew which one. He lit first. They were all waiting, but no longer for Rome. Rome had answered, and that answer had been silence. Brother Luca had not returned. No. Messengers had been sent in his place, and while the church in Florence still held mass, still rang bells, still held fast to its rituals and rhythms, there was a gap where edicts used to be, a pause where orders once thundered, and everyone knew, in that pause, something else was speaking. On the 5th night, after the frost, a sound swept through the streets, just before dawn. Not thunder, not music, a Low, rhythmic, ancient. Some said it came from beneath the stones. Others swore it came from the windows, the wells, the mouths of statues left hollow by time. No one could agree on what it was, but every dog in the city refused to bark that night, and every candle, even those guarded from the wind, flickered in perfect rhythm to a beat no one could name. At the villa, Vittoria was already awake. Not because of the hum, because of the dream. She had seen a woman she did not recognize standing in her mother's kitchen. The woman wore armor made of lace and ink. Her hands were covered in ashdot, and she was smiling. Not at Vittoria. Through her. When Vittoria woke, there was a smear of soot on her palm and a sprig of basil in her bed. She didn't ask who placed it there. She simply rose and poured the tea. The council tried one last move, a public decree, not against Vittoria. That would have been too bold, too foolish. Against the idea of the garden, they framed it in terms of health. A plague. They said a rot in the northern quarter. Women gathering in secret, spreading herbs, whispers, possibly illness. They called it a matter of public order, and declared that all gatherings of more than 3 women in any household would henceforth be banned. The decree was posted at every fountain it lasted. 6 hours by sunset, each copy had been painted over with crushed lavender, and a single word etched in soot. We gather. No arrests were made, no charges filed, because no one wanted to be the one to knock on the door and find out what kind of tea would be waiting. But the garden was not without cost. That night, the tailor's apprentice, the one who had made the first satchels, stitched with thread soaked in sage and rose oil, was found on the bridge at dawn. Not broken, not bled, just still, as if sleep had caught him mid-step and refused to let go. In his hand was a button, shaped like a crescent moon, and on his tongue a single seed of henbane. The message was clear. The rot could still reach them, even now, especially now. Vittoria did not weep. She unpinned her hair, buried the boy in the northern corner, beneath the rosemary, and placed a sprig of rue over his chest. She did not speak a prayer. She did not need to. The garden remembered, and that was enough. In Siena, Nerina was already gathering the others. Women who had heard the hum and answered with their own. From Venice, a widow who had taught herself Greek just to read one forbidden book. From Bologna, a pharmacist who had once disguised a rebellion in a shipment of lavender oil. From Ferrara, a woman with 3 names and no fingerprints. They came quietly, through cellars along rivers, disguised as merchants, pilgrims, dancers, and when they reached the villa, they did not knock. They simply walked through the rosemary and waited to be seen, and the garden saw them. It knew its own by the new moon. Florence was different. Not publicly, not visibly. The bells still rang. The markets still bustled. The priests still preached. But beneath it all, a second rhythm pulsed at every fountain. Someone had placed a small bowl of herbs, lavender, rue, dried orange peel. It changed daily. No one admitted to tending them, but they were always full. The council, desperate to regain footing, commissioned a playwright to satirize the movement. A play called The Thorn in the Flame was staged in the main square. It mocked herbalists, mocked women, mocked gardens. The crowd did not laugh, not once. Halfway through, someone placed a single violet on the stage, and the lead actor forgot his next line. Then the next. The play ended in silence, and the playwright was never seen again. The final message came on the night of the equinox. A raven, dead, but placed gently on the steps of the council hall, its wings folded, its eyes covered with silk, and in its beak a scroll. You were warned. The next morning 3 councilmen resigned. One took vows and entered a monastery without explanation. 1 fled to Naples. 1 vanished entirely. The council did not meet again for 2 weeks. In the meantime, the city simply kept going. Food was traded, bread was baked, children played, and when a woman was insulted in the square, 5 strangers stepped forward before she could even open her mouth. None of them spoke. They just stood beside her. That was all it took. Back at the villa, Vittoria sat beneath the olive tree. Her braid was loose, her robe stained with ink and wine. She was tired, but not worn. Around her, The garden breathed alive, watching, waiting. Tommaso stood beside her. Silent, he had not spoken in 3 days. He didn't need to. Words were no longer the sharpest tool they had. Presence was. And presence was everywhere. In every window that stayed lit. 1 minute longer than needed. In every letter sent with no signature, and perfect PENMANSHIP. In every sprig of rue, left, beside a statue. They had won nothing, but they had lost nothing either. And in Florence, that was power. It wasn't the revolution they'd once imagined. It was quieter, stranger, more stubborn. A kind of rootedness that could not be shaken. Only grown around, like ivy, like silence, like truth. Vittoria closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the wind had changed again. The wind did not howl. It whispered through the alleyways, across the rooftops, past the broken shutters of forgotten towers. The wind whispered as if it carried a memory too old to be spoken aloud. A memory made of perfume and ash, of things lost in kitchens and gardens, and locked cellars no one dared open anymore. Florence, still breathing but not blinking. On the night the city changed for the last time, no one noticed at first. No bells rang, no blood spilled, there was no trumpet, no riot, just a chill soft, precise, almost kind that moved through the air, like a sigh in reverse. A woman lit a lantern in the southern quarter, and found that the wick burned violet. A baker opened her oven to remove the morning bread, and discovered rosemary leaves in the crust, though she hadn't used any. A child opened a book she'd hidden from her tutor and found that the margins now carried words she couldn't remember writing but understood all the same. It began like that, not with fire, with remembering Vittoria. Rose before the moon that evening. She walked the garden without shoes, without a shawl, without her satchel of bitter roots and guarded intentions. She walked as though she had not just survived a war but authored one. Behind her, Adelina followed. In silence, her sleeves were inked and paid. Her nails smelled of pepper and nightshade. But her eyes were calm, the kind of calm that comes only after the fire is out, and you are the only one still standing in the smoke. Isabetta walked behind them both, no longer trembling, no longer scribbling. She held nothing in her hands, not even her notes. She didn't need to. She remembered everything now, even the names of the ones they had buried, even the taste of the first poison they ever brewed in secret, even the last laugh of the boy who died with a crescent moon stitched to his coat. Vittoria led them to the olive tree, the same one where the birds had once refused to sing, the same one under which the tailor's apprentice now slept, his grave marked only by rosemary and silence. There were more graves now, for in the garden, 2 in the hills, 1 in the well, all women, all remembered, none forgotten. They stood in a triangle, eyes toward the north. The stars were unusually clear that night, as if something above them, 2 had chosen to witness, to record, to stay in the city. The final council meeting was already underway. It was not public. There were no minutes taken. The doors were locked from within. Salviati stood at the head of the table, though his hands trembled so fiercely they spilled ink across the papers he'd meant to sign. Of the original 13 councilmen, only 7 remained. 3 had resigned. 2 had disappeared entirely. 1 had been found in his study, eyes wide open, staring at a single sprig of rue left on his desk, though no doors had been broken, no locks forced, no windows opened. The council was quiet now, not with the calm of men in control, but the hush of those who know the end has arrived, and are still hoping to bargain with it. They were signing, they claimed, a decree of peace, not surrender peace. They worded it carefully. A repeal of the decree against gatherings, a restoration of public rights to herbal knowledge and apothecary, practice a general pardon for all accused of botanical subversion. They did not name Vittoria. They did not name the garden, because to name it would be to give it shape, and shape, they feared, might become shadow, might become law, might become legend, might become the kind of story that outlives them all. So they signed the paper, sealed it with wax, and then they burned it. Not because they wished to erase it, but because even they understood The garden needed no permission, only acknowledgement, and the fire, for once, was theirs to offer, in the hills outside. Florence, the wind shifted again, and the women returned. Not all of them. Some would never return. Some had planted new roots in distant soil. Some were simply too tired to come home. But those who did return walked without hesitation. Through city gates, past cathedrals, into kitchens and courtyards and lecture halls. They returned not as guests, but as gardeners. Back in the villa, the final brew was ready. Not a poison, not a cure, something in between. A tonic, a memory, a truth. Vittoria handed it to Isabella, without speaking. Isabella drank, without asking. Then Adelina, then Vittoria herself. It burned, not like fire, like recognition. Like something waking up inside you that had been quiet. Too long they said nothing for 10 minutes, because some silences are sacred then. Finally, Adelina whispered, "It's done," Vittoria nodded. Double quotes, yes. Not triumph, not joy, not even relief, just yes, because there was no parade, no feast, no banner, just the garden, still here, still growing, in the weeks that followed. Florence changed quietly. The council meetings continued, but with fewer rules and more listening. The churches remained open, but some priests began asking questions they had never dared ask before. Markets thrived. Art bloomed, and every Thursday, at sunset, in the square where the mocking play had once died in silence, a group of women met, not to protest, not to chant, to teach. One brought tinctures, another maps, another poems. There were no titles, no speeches, just chairs, chalk. A city learning how to remember itself. No one built statues for the women of the garden. No medals were minted, no frescoes painted. But that winter, a strange thing happened. Every house that had once received a sprig of rue, tied in red thread, began to bloom in ways no one could explain. Tomatoes grew in cold windows. Poppies opened under snow. And in the garden, the hellebore did something it had never done before. It sang, not with sound, with presence. Each petal tilted upward, toward the sky, and held its shape like a mouth, just barely open in prayer. Visitors to the villa would sometimes hear a hum. They couldn't place, not frightening, not loud, just enduring, like something remembering itself through root and leaf and time. Vittoria never married. She never left Florence. She never wrote a book, never gave an interview, never opened the villa to the public. But when she walked through the markets, people stepped aside, not out of fear, out of rhythm, as though they knew somewhere deeper than reason that she walked not alone. But with a garden at her heels, Adelina became a teacher, not in schools, but in kitchens. She trained a generation, in plants and fire, but also in waiting, in silence, in knowing when not to speak, and when to say only the word that changes everything. Isabella traveled. She wrote letters in every port, sent vials and scrolls, and soft warnings wrapped in velvet to cities that hadn't yet learned to listen. But eventually she returned, older, quieter, still remembering. She had not forgotten the first lesson. That truth, when grown well, always comes back. As for Tommaso, he left one night. No note, just a mark in the soil where he'd once carved circles. Some say he joined a monastery, where silence was law. Others say he walked to the sea and began again. But those who know the garden best believe this. He went where he was needed. Next. Because gardens grow, and the world is full of soil, waiting to remember, and the villa, still there, covered in ivy now, quieter than ever, but never empty. People pass by without knowing what they're looking at. They say it smells like memory. They say the air is warmer near the rosemary. They say that sometimes, at dusk, if you listen, just right, you can hear the leaves whispering. They never say the word witch. They never say the word poison. But some say she still walks the paths barefoot, long hair braided, hands full of root. And when she passes, nothing dies. Everything remembers.